Good morning. We are going to start session 3. This afternoon, we'll take you to the world of poetry and narrative of Korean diaspora. I'd like to introduce our guest, a professor and a poet, Jae-chan Chung. Professor Chung is a devoted educator at Department of Korean Language Education at Hanyang University, but also he's leading popularization of poetry through his teaching and multiple channels of mass media. He believes that poetry, we can share confession, emotions, and comfort through the magic of poetry in this modern society where poetry is largely absent. Please welcome Professor Chung Jae-chan.
Originally, I planned to give my speech in Korean because as a professor of Korean language education, naturally I can speak Korean much better than English. But this morning I changed my mind because my former speakers, they all speak English. But I'm not so influent as them, so please be patient with my speech. It's my first time entirely in my life speaking in English in the public. Yes, my title is Guns, Flowers, and Poetry. Don't mix up with Professor Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. A few years ago, I happened to see a picture on the Facebook. I think a guy, a baby, is so cute and innocent. But I shouldn't have even smiled. No matter how many photos I see on social media, no matter how much I try to excuse myself for being so casual about it, I can't forgive myself for seeing the picture as cute. Why? This picture is from on September 2nd, 2015, a 3-year-old boy, Alan Kurdi, lay his face down in the cold sand on a beach in Bodrum, Turkey. He had fled his civil war-ridden hometown of Kobani, Syria, for the Greek island of Kos, when his refugee boat capsized, leaving him, his mother, and his 5-year-old brother to end their short lives together. Why? There was no place in the world, no country in the world that would accept this child but heaven, the kingdom of the God. Nilüfer Demir, the journalist who photographed Kurdi, might feel the same way I did. He said, taking pictures was the only way to express the screams of the silent Kurdi's body and the best way to publicize this tragedy. So the photo became a poem, and so Kurdi became a poet. He accused the so-called advanced countries, the many empires of Europe that have closed their doors to refugees, excusing that they couldn't afford it. The unscrupulous smugglers who are blinded only by money, the traders who fake even life jackets, the civil wars that have irresponsibly turned people into refugees, and the madness and ambition of the capital and the power. That's what refugees are like. Many refugees were abandoned, hurt, and killed. We Koreans had a time like that too. There was a time when crossing the Korean peninsula from south to north and north to south was a risk of life and limb, like a refugee. This happened even before the Korean War 1950. I'll show the poem written by 1947. Spring 1947, late night. The sea in Haeju, Hwanghae-do, Yongdang, the border line between the south and north. The boatman was rowing cautiously, where he swallowed a crying infant. Even 20 years later, no one knows the depths of the sea. It is written by Jong Sam Kim. The title is Civilian. The first stanza of the poem is read like the first line of the second stanza, as if the boatman is paddling carefully through the water, tense but very slowly. When the infant's crying broke through the tension and silence, the parents would have to cover the infant's mouth, and it would become a secret, something they would have to keep close to their chest for years and years. Sadly, this is the reality. But the dead are not the only ones to be pitied. The survivors also suffered from loneliness and guilt and had to suffer terribly just to survive. In some cases, they had to live through the long days without knowing if their separated family members were alive or dead. In 1987, KBS, the Korean broadcast, live broadcast of the search for separated families was one of the world's most moving dramas. It is a kind of an epic in fact. The live broadcast became a poem. Sometimes the reality itself is much more poetic than poetry. Hwang Jiu's poem, Finally the Man in His 40s, is a poem that was created by transcribing that live broadcast itself as if the poet was editing and commenting on the television footage. The content is like this. Scene number 1. Finally, the forest man cries like a baby calling the name Jung-soo. 2. The forest woman in the studio in Busan, Korea, freaked out in front of the camera. 3. The forest man in the Seoul studio, now with his face raised and his mouth open, sobbing like a lost 10-year-old child crying in the street. He calls out for Jung-soo. 4. The announcer tries to clamp him down, but a massive tidal wave, a huge spasm is now going through his entire body. 5. The separate families in the audience who were waiting for their turn to be aired let go of their picket signs and applauded. Number 6. The camera again focuses on the people standing in rows and columns with the picket signs in front of their chest. Something goes on. In the summer of that year, 1983, the whole Koreans wept. Family members who hadn't seen each other in 30 years, viewers who watched it, and everyone cried. So, what was originally planned as a one-time 90 minutes special TV program was extended to a 24 hours vigil that very day, and then broadcast live continued for a total of 138 days long. When everyone was amazed at the power of broadcasting, grateful for the station's initiative, and otherwise wondering why they hadn't come up with the idea after more than 30 years of not being able to meet so easily, everyone was crying and laughing like fools. 100,000 separated families participated, and about 10,000 families had reunions through this program. On the very night of the first broadcast of that TV show, Seolun-do, who is a very popular singer in Korea, but at the time, he is an unknown singer until then, changed the lyrics to an existing song and recorded it just in 5 hours and went straight to the TV station the next day with a new song. The song with the new lyric, "My brother and I share our feelings that we haven't met, yet where are my mom and dad? I'm calling out them." The song immediately exploded on the airwaves and became a huge mega hit. That's the song that made Seorundo what he is today. Lost 30 years, the song has since been recognized by the Guinness Book of the World Records as a hit song in the shortest time ever.
이 기쁜 소식을 누구한테 전해 누구냐 부모한테 전하지.
Can you remember this? But even this movie-like reunion was only allowed if the separated family members were still living in South Korea. Even before the Korean War, it was not easy to cross into South Korea until the reunification of separate families between the two Koreas. KBS live broadcasts were just a picture in the minds of many people who left their families in the north when they defected to the south. Not only that, but as shown in the director Im Kwon-taek's movie Gil So-tum, many of them have given up the chance to reunion, either because of unavoidable circumstances or for the safety of their families in the north. Therefore, we must recognize their suffering as they had to spend decades away from their families. What did they do to deserve such a punishment? The Korean War generated many refugees. One of the novels that depicts the situation well is Lee Ho-cheol's Defection, means escaping of hometown, not loss of hometown, escape. The novel tells the story of four people, Do-chan and Kwang-seok, who are just 24 years old, and 19-year-old boy I, and Ha-won, who is 1 year younger than I. Each of them left their hometown to South Korea by blindly boarding a boat because the Chinese army was closing in. When they meet on the ship, they are madly happy to see each other. Yeah, you are on, you are on, you are on. After 1 or 2 nights on the boat, they reached the streets of Busan only one morning. All four of them had never been a foreign land before, so they looked at each other in confusion. When they were in hometown, they were only aunts and uncles within the village, but under this Busan sky, it was new to them. Yeah, now the day the four of us fall apart is the day we die, the day we die. Why did they jump on board, and why were they so happy to see each other even though it's not been a while since they met? To find out, we first need to know about the withdrawal from Hungnam. In fact, we know less of the Korean War than World War II. We Koreans do like that. We know about the Normandy landings, but we don't know well about the Incheon landings. We know well Auschwitz, but we don't know well the tragedy of Hungnam Pier. The U.S. 1st Marine Division, which is spearheaded the Incheon landings, advanced to Jangjin Lake on the Korean Peninsula on November 25, 1950. In response to MacArthur's order for an all-out assault to end the war, 2 days later, however, the Marines were surrounded by Chinese troops who employed a human wave strategy. The news that 12,000 troops were isolated and in danger of being wiped out plunged South Korea and the United States into a period of great tension. Rumors of an atomic bomb being dropped on Manchuria, as the previous poem finally the man in his 40s, were also circulating at that time. American forces on the Western Front also abandoned Pyongyang and decided to withdraw. However, since the Chinese troops had descended on Wonsan, they had to withdraw by sea rather than land. The U.S. Marine had to break through the encirclement and withdraw 240 kilometers from Jangjin Lake to Hungnam. They had crossed the Gema Plateau and most importantly, fight with the frigid weather. Their hands and feet froze, their guns froze, and their blood froze, making it impossible to transfuse the wounded. The Battle of Jangjin Lake is considered one of the world's two greatest winter battles, along with the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II. On December 12th, the operation for the withdrawal from Hungnam finally begins. A total of 193 transports were mobilized. Off the coast of Hungnam, 13 U.S. aircraft carriers bombarded the Chinese troops with gunfire and aerial bombardment day and night. At the end of the withdrawal, the U.S. military completely destroyed the port of Hungnam. The operation brought 105,000 U.S. and South Korean troops and nearly 100,000 evacuees out of North Korea. The withdrawal ended on December 24, Christmas Eve of that year. But the original U.S. military withdrawal plan did not include the civilian evacuee transportation. The Korean evacuees were flocked to Hungnam, could only wait in despair at the deck, which had no windbreak. The blizzard were relentless and unrelenting. The decision to evacuate civilians was made at the last minute. Transport ships and landing craft came from South Korea and Japan. Landing craft with a capacity of 1,000 carried up to 5,000 people. The American cargo ship Victory carried 14,000 people in one ship. Still, not everyone was able to escape. Some families were scattered, while others remained in their homes because they thought they would only have to flee for about a week. Meanwhile, due to the time constraints of the operation, many evacuees desperately clung on, got stuck in the gates, or drowned in the sea when the gates finally closed. They were left on the burning dock of Hungnam. Now you can understand why the characters in novel The Escaping from Hungnam Town were blindly boarding the ship and why they were madly excited. That's how we survived. It was the Korean Exodus. It was a Christmas miracle that happened not in the Red Sea, but in the East Sea. If it hadn't been for the humanitarian decision of the United States to help the refugees get on the warships, they all would have become Kurudis and been buried on the beach with no names. They didn't dump us at sea. Rather, they dumped the weapons on the warships into the sea. It's been 70 years since then. Let's think of Kurdi again. His sacrifice had opened the doors of Europe, somewhat to refugees, but this hope for humanity was short-lived. On Friday, November 13, 2015, of the same year, just over 2 months later, Paris was bathed in blood. It was terrorism. It was a massacre. 130 people were killed. A few days later, a video was posted on the French outlet Le Petit Journal. Paris was in a state of grief and despair, but the square was filled with bouquets of flowers and candles to honor the victims. The video shows the Vietnamese immigrant father and his son. His son's name is Brandon, talking in the square. The younger son, who looks innocent enough, even worries about moving away to escape the attacks, but his father tells him with a warm look, "No, don't worry. We don't have to move a house. France is our home. But there are bad people, right, Dad? Bad people are everywhere. Bad people have guns and they can shoot us because they are bad and they have guns, Dad. Look, they have guns, but we have flowers, don't we? But we can't do anything with the flowers, can we? See the flowers they are putting out? They are there to fight the guns. Flowers protect us? Of course. And candles? Yes. That's so we don't forget those who left us." So I ask you, in this age of barbarism, can the flower triumph over the gun and thus protect the Kurdi as Brandon believed? And now I turn the poetry for the answer. In Korean poetry, Namsupa. Grandma take flower seeds on top of the dugout, accidentally bloomed. Rose moss seeds she takes. Inside the dugout, instead of entering it all, the less said about my grandma is just furious. If I died at the time, all of this, all of that, I wouldn't have to see. Well, Grandma, what do you mean by that? Saying so little, Grandma's anger, I couldn't diffuse it. Grandma takes flower seeds. Now, if the earth were to crumble and disappear, Grandma would still take while she was alive that tiny flower seed. Poet Nam Soo-pak was born in Pyongyang in North Korea. In other words, the poet was also a refugee. Anyway, the grandmother is getting frustrated and talking less, and she doesn't care about her life anymore. She doesn't even enter the air raid shelter at all. However, she takes the seeds of an insignificant rose moss. Even a rose moss that bloomed by chance, a rose moss that is hard to harvest and irritating because it is too small. Wait, a rose moss? Do you remember the children's song in the flower garden? Maybe all of the Koreans can remember and sing this song. 아빠하고 나하고 만든 꽃밭에 채송화도 봉숭아도 한창입니다. 아빠가 메어놓은 새끼줄 따라 나팔꽃도 어울리게 피었습니다. Yes, it's a pure and bright song, but it was, in fact, composed in 1953. When he was in the route of refugee, how Kwon Gil-sang made this song, how during the chaos of the evacuation, what did the dead make a flower garden for? During the war, Grandma saved rose moss seeds and Dad planted them. Moreover, Nam Soo-pak wrote it as a poem and Ki Sang-kwon wrote it as a song. Could it be that the rose mosses that Grandma and Dad grew was the me in the poem and song? Could it be the rose moss seeds are their children, and that's why we can enjoy the poems and songs in the flower garden now? Now we come back to the flowers again. Though through wartime poetry and music, flowers bloomed during the war and the people grew them. The rose moss garden was in real world, not fantasy or romance. But real or imagined, it doesn't matter. What matters is planting flowers next to military boot prints, trying tying flowers to gun barrels and putting flowers on muzzles. Let's see a real-life scene. In the photograph Woman with Flowers by master photographer Mark Ribot, on October 21, 1967, a protest against the Vietnam War was held in front of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. here. A 17-year-old high school girl named Joan Rose Casimir, even whose middle name is Rose, had a flower in front of armed soldiers. A woman with a flower is more powerful than a soldier with a gun. That's because she looks so confident. Let's see an imaginary scene in a painting by cartoonist Ji Hyun-gon in Korea. He suffered from spinal tuberculosis and was paralyzed from the waist down, unable to go outside for 40 years after the first grade of elementary school. He made each painting with his left hand alone, with blood and sweat. Tearful paintings by the beautiful artist. It is a painting that opens our heart and makes us smile just by looking at. The ruins of a battlefield, more peaceful than peacetime, and a shining flower rather than the heart. The child holding the flower has no doubts, no fears, because he is pure. Guns cannot beat flowers. When guns win, people die. Bigger guns kill more people. It's always women, children, and the disabled men who stand up to tough men, adult violence, and mainstream of the dominance. Only the sick know pain. The small fix the big. The soft triumphs over the powerful. So, the flower triumphs over the gun, and that's what poetry tries to emulate flowers. Poetry is the language of the margins that awakens the vanity or arrogance of the dominant languages. Today, on the 70th anniversary of the U.S. Republic of Korea alliance, peace has been maintained, but the era of the barbarism seems to be far from over. How can it endure the time without flowers, poetry, and song? So we can only endure again by listening to Bob Dylan, an American singer who is now a Nobel Prize-winning poet. How much road must a man walk down before you call him a man? How many seas must a white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? I'm not Professor Yoon. President Yoon, sorry. Korea and United States are friends. The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. But do we know the answer? The answer is blowing not in the wind, in our mind. Thank you for listening.
Right? I didn't know that Professor Chung can sing so well. So I'm going to open the floor for the question. So who will be the first person to ask a question or a comment?
It's not out of question, it's just moving and hailing us.
because I'm sitting in the front row. Your lecture was very, very fascinating and very inspiring, and I really enjoyed a lot. And your English is more than perfect, so be very confident. And as a first generation, is also I do the same kind of excuses, but I just stop in certain moment. And my question is, all these beautiful poems and songs and everything were written by maybe, because I cannot really tell, who experienced the war, right? Or someone who didn't. Because my question is there any kind of indication or differences or distinction between the one who experienced the war or the one never experienced indirectly, who got the information through the films and novels and anywhere else? I don't know if you're familiar with this Post-Memory by Marianne Hirsch, who did experience, but we have a whole right to, whole privilege to revisit and recreate, reimagine, what happened in the past. So as a professor, if you see any kind of 차이가 있었다면, 겪은 사람과 안 겪은 사람, and could you just lecturing a little bit? Thank you very much.
Actually, I didn't experience the Korean War. I'm young. 아마 제너레이션 갭 말한 것 같아요, 그죠? 근데 이거는 언제나 있는 일이에요. 정말 언제든지, 가령 뭐 광주 그것도 마찬가지고요. 다 우리는 과거의 걸 얘기해요. 근데 그거를 그냥 어떤 히스토릭 나리지로 접근하는 것과 저는 이렇게 무빙하는 건 전혀 다른 문제라고 생각을 했고, 그래서 저는 거기에 아직도 문학의 힘이 있다라고 생각을 했고요. 근데 문제는 젊은이들이 문학을 싫어하는 거예요. 그러면 이제 역사는 공부한들 그건 그냥 좀 볼드디고 문학은 싫고, 그럼 어떻게 해야 될까? 그래서 사실은 지금 이렇게 제가 강의했던 것처럼 강의의 레시피를 바꾸기 시작했습니다. 그래서 그 당시에 영화, 광고 아니면 지금 아이들이 즐기는 뭐 노래 뭐 등등을 그걸 이제 하나의 일종의 문화적 컨텐츠로 만들어서 그것 자체가 하나의 강연이고 그거 하나가 강의가 될 수 있게 매 강의를 만드는 거예요. 지금 이거 만들듯이. 그러면서 이제 학생들이 훨씬 더 지적인 의무로부터 해방되니까 좀 느끼기 시작했던 것 같고, 그 다음에 제가 숙제를 내주는 거예요. 그러면 너네 역사를 너네들만의 own 크리에이티브 컨텐츠로 한번 만들어라. 우리가 하던 것만 하지 말고. 그러면 저는 자꾸 올드 레파토리만 나올 거 아니에요, 꼰대니까. 근데 너네 세대의 컨텐츠 그럼 지금 어떻게 만들어서 나중에 다음 제너레이션에 전해줄래? 그 점이 저는 중요한 기억의 문제고, 그래서 지금 정확한 단어를 써주셨는데요. 그래서 중요한 게 메모리 같아요. 그리고 특히 어떤 cultural memories, 이거를 어떻게 우리가 쉐어하느냐, 그것이 저는 더 지식보다 더 중요한 역사적인 공유물이 아닌가 그렇게 생각하고 있습니다.
So I think I'm going to really briefly translate Professor Jung's answer. So of course we have a generation gap. Not all the generation can experience that particular historical event. But however, as he showed to us today through literature, mass media, film, and there's other contents that we can, the generation that did not experience that historical event, they can imagine, they can bring the memory of that particular event. Is there any other question?
한국말이 편하시니까 간단하게 여쭤보면, 그럼 지금 방금 이제 한국에 있는 젊은 차세대들한테 이렇게 해서 아이디어를 받고 걔네들이 연구하고 생각할 수 있게 하신다 그랬잖아요. 그럼 미국에 있는 차세대들한테는 어떠한 방향으로 저희 동포들이 차세대들한테 하면 좋을까를 아이디어를 주신다면 어떻게 하실 건지.
너무 바라던 질문해 주셔서 진짜 고마워요. 제가 사실은 우리나라에서도 시라고 하는 것이 많이 잊혀진 장르였는데 제가 좀 럭키해서 여하튼 제가 좀 베스트셀러도 하고요. 뭐 좀 이렇게 방송 이런 것도 하다 보니까 방송에서 시를 읽는 일이 벌어졌어요. 그건 정말 저희 세대에선 불가능하다고 생각했어요. 근데 어느 날부터 제 눈이 좀 떠진 게 뭐냐면 좀 적절한 비율일지 모르겠는데 내수 시장은 이만하면 됐는데 수출을 좀 해야 되겠다. 뭐 K자 붙는 거 썩 좋아하진 않는데요. K 포임인들 뭐 안 될 게 어디 있겠느냐 하는 좀 꿈을 꿔보기 시작했어요. 예. 왜냐하면 저 국문학 공부할 때 제가 보들레르 공부하고 엘리어트 공부하느라고 얼마나 고생했는지 아세요? 전 세계에 리벤지를 하고 싶었어요. 너네 김수월 공부해봐. 농담이고요. 좀 이거 좀 많이 전 세계의 문화유산을 좀 했으면 좋겠다. 근데 그러려면 먼저 우리 제외국민분들부터 즐기는 게 있어야지. 정작 우리 국민들은 우리 시 몰라요 하고 있는데 제가 외국 사람한테 가서 소월 얘기할 수 없잖아요. 그래서 작년에 제가 미시간 그 대학의 한국학 연구소에 그냥 제가 졸라가지고 전 무조건 강연할 시간을 달라 그랬어요. 그래서 이제 교민들 한 20-30명이 왔어요. 그래가지고 제가 한국에서 늘 강연하는 대로 그날 이제 제 주제가 별이었는데 또 하나는 육사와 동주 같은 것도 강연을 했고요. 그런 것만이 아니라 그냥 별에 대해서 얘기했어요. 그러면서 아까 여러분 동요했던 것처럼 이거 기억나시죠? 바람이 선을 도하여 뜰 앞에 나섰더니 서산모 이걸 하는데 처음엔 막 교포들이 이렇게 신나서 따라하다가 이제 막 화음도 넣더라. 자기들 막 그러더니 나중에는 노래 부르면서 우는 거예요. 즐겁게 우는 거예요. 근데 이게 뭐 슬프게 우는 것이 아니라 많은 향수와 어린 시절 이런 게 겹쳐졌겠죠. 그래서 그걸 경험하면서 좀 어떤 제가 좀 짜릿함을 느꼈어요. 그래서 사실은 오늘 이 행사에도 제가 막 자원해서 도서관 옆에 쫄라가지고 나 가야 된다. 그래서 오늘은 뭐 제목은 한미동맹 70주년이었지만 그걸 넘어서서 교민분들이 조금 더 이 시를 사랑하게 할 수 있다면은 저는 이렇게 가요 속에서도 수많은 시를 발견할 수 있고요. 또 우리가 갖고 있는 역사에서도 많은 그런 것들을 할 수 있기 때문에 그런 컨텐츠를 조금만 더 밀도 있게 좀 만들어주면은 당신들의 모국어의 가장 아름다운 모국어들, 잃어버렸던 것들 그런 걸 한번 회복시켜 드렸으면 합니다. 예, 해볼게요.
So the question is, Professor Chang is use literature to the young generation to, to bring the memory of all this historical memory. And our audience ask how we can do that for young Korean American, the young Korean Americans. So Professor Chang's answer is poetry is largely forgotten. However, he still tried to, bring using different literature to bring these historical memory to young Korean Americans. I think I'm so sorry. My translation is not precise, but I try to make brief as much as possible. So I think we have time for one more question. What do you think?
For a good presentation, and I think Ho Chul-lee, Lee Ho Chul, I think he's a novelist who pioneered the literature in a divided Korean peninsula, and but now I don't know how after Hyo Chul died, does any literature, I don't know how the literature of divided Korean peninsula has developed, and also in the meantime we should think about literature in a unified Korea. Is there any difference between the latter half before Ho Chul-lee and before Ho Chul, after Ho Chul? So could you describe that situation there?
예, 사실 요즘은 좀 분단에 관한 것이 많이 사라지거나 줄어든 건 사실인 것 같아요. 즉 남한의 문제, 우리의 행복 지수가 높다 보니까 거기까지 별로 생각을 안 하는 것 같고, 근데 이제 최근에는 가령 김현수 같은 소설가가 그 백석이라고 하는 시인이 북한에 넘어가 가지고 결국은 자기 꿈을 펼치지 못하는 그런 것도 담아내면서 이제는 좀 통일 뭐 분단 이런 문제보다는 그 젊은 작가들이 우리가 갖고 있는 자유의 소중함 뭐 이제 이런 거를 더 많이 돌보는 것 같기도 하고요. 과거에는 분단에 관한 것을 거의 의무로 지금 했다 그러면은 앞으로는 우리가 사는 삶의 질의 입장에서 접근하지 않을까 좀 그런 생각을 하고 지금 질문하신 것처럼 이호철 선생 세대 이후에는 분단이라고 하는 것이 그렇게 강하게 우리 소설에서 임팩트를 끼치고 있지는 못한 것 같아요. 그래서 사실 제가 오늘 이 세미나 준비하면서도 한미 동맹이라고 하는 것을 예를 들어 그건 무슨 politically 아니면 뭐 군사적인 이렇게 바라보게 되면은 별로 제가 할 수 있는 말이 없을 것 같다. 저는 오히려 어떤 생각을 했냐면은 자꾸 이거를 코리안 피닌슐러의 어떤 특별한 문제로 다루기보다는 제가 일부러 그 쿠르디라든가 이런 사진을 갖고 온 이유도 사실은 한미 간의 관계가 글로벌리 어떤 의미를 갖느냐, 그 다음에 평화적으로 어떤 의미를 갖느냐. 그래서 오히려 한국과 미국의 어떤 6.25 이 컨텍스트를 좀 확장하면 우리 레퓨지들을 지금은 다 아예 못 오게 막고 있었는데 그때 그 자기네들 무기를 오히려 버리고 우리 남면 싣고 넘어온 이 사건을 이게 오히려 좀 더 한미 동맹이 스탠드 포 하는 상징이 아닐까. 그런 걸 해야지 우리가 뭐 소비에트를 물리쳤다라든가 그거보다 훨씬 이게 더 큰 글로벌한 미닝을 갖는 거라고 생각을 했어요. 그래서 우리가 분단 아주 중요한 문제지만 이젠 분단보다 더 큰 어떤 글로벌한 과제 입장에서 우리 젊은 다음 세대들이 어떻게 생각을 하고 있는지 그 안에 오히려 뭐 부분 집합으로 분단이 들어가는 그런 것이 우리 다음 세대의 프라이드가 되지 않을까 좀 그래 혼자 생각을 이렇게 하고 있습니다. Too difficult, right?
So I think it's boiled down to one thing. We should move away from the rhetorics of division. And it's time to rethink different meanings, the peace, and what we can do for. So I think it's a time's up. Okay. So thank you so much for your participation. I'm going to come back for the fourth session, and I think fourth session we don't have interpretation, right? Good. So we'll have a short break again, and let's come back for the next session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.